This video is brought to you by NordVPN. Unsurprisingly, the war in Ukraine has created tensions between ordinary Russians, who are, at least according to polling, overwhelmingly supportive of Putin's invasion, and the rest of Europe, which isn't. This has created enormous friction in the Baltics, which are home to almost 1 million people of Russian ethnicity. Since Putin invaded, Baltic governments have passed a series of laws aimed at their Russian minorities, including laws in Estonia and Latvia banning Russian in schools, which has been criticised by the UN as a violation of Russian minorities' human rights. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why the Baltics have so many ethnic Russians, how attitudes towards them have changed since the war, and whether these policies are justifiable. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First, a bit of history. Ethnic Russians have been migrating across the Russian Empire from Russia into the Baltics since the dissolution of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century. But more intense Russification efforts began at the end of World War II, when the Baltic states became Soviet republics. Before the war, Stalin actually pursued a policy of indigenization, which aimed to preserve minority culture by federalizing state structure. But after the war, he performed a complete U-turn, actively promoting Russian culture and even deported entire nationalities for their suspected collaboration with Nazis. Between 1946 and 1953, something like 95,000 Estonians, 125,000 Latvians, and 310,000 Lithuanians were killed or deported by the Soviets. At the same time, the USSR started industrializing the republics and moving thousands of ethnic Russians into urban areas, creating large Russian minorities which still exist today. After the collapse of the USSR, the Baltic republics resented the Soviets' population policies and often implemented policies that actively discriminated against non-indigenous minorities. In Latvia and Estonia, for example, citizenship was granted to only those who could trace their family living in the two countries before 1940, which pretty much excluded the majority of Russians living there and meant that they couldn't vote in elections. Unsurprisingly, this meant that the number of Russian speakers started declining sharply after the fall of communism. In 1989, the Russian-speaking minority accounted for 34% of the population in Latvia, 30% in Estonia, and 6% in Lithuania. By 2020, this number had decreased to 25% in Latvia and Estonia. There were lots of reasons for this, but some of the big ones include low birth rates, emigration to Russia or other EU countries, and assimilation. Even before the war, there were tensions between these ethnic Russians and the Baltics. In Estonia, for example, there are some 330,000 ethnic Russians, but 80,000 or so haven't passed Estonia's language test, and so are neither citizens of Estonia or Russia. Instead of a mauve Estonian EU passport, these 80,000 people only get a light grey so-called aliens passport. They can access public services and pay tax, but they're not allowed to vote in national elections. A similar situation exists for about 40,000 ethnic Russians in Latvia, and these citizenless ethnic Russians are actually one of the largest groups of stateless people in the world. Stateless ethnic Russians also have lower incomes, employment rates, and life expectancies than their Baltic counterparts. Unsurprisingly, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated these tensions. Latvia has already split the Latvian Orthodox Church from the Russian one, banned some Russian TV channels, and prohibited the use of the Russian language at airports, train stations, and any institution providing public services. But the Latvian government last year passed a new law that would make Latvian the only language used in schools by 2025. Estonia passed a similar law in December, and it was one of the hot topics at Estonia's recent election. While these policies are, in a sense, understandable, they've been roundly criticised by the UN for violating ethnic Russians' rights. In May, Latvia also introduced new mandatory language exams, which will require every person under 75 with Russian citizenship residing in Latvia to pass a basic language exam or face expulsion. While no one has been expelled under the new law yet, when or if this happens, it'll definitely provoke a reaction from the UN. So, are these policies justifiable, or has the UN got a point? Now, because we're a neutral channel, we're not going to come down on a side here. We're just going to give you the arguments and you can make your mind up at the end. As we see it, the main argument in favour of these policies is a security argument. Essentially, Baltic governments argue that the presence of a large ethnic Russian, exclusively Russian-speaking minority amounts to a security risk, because they might be persuaded by Russian propaganda into defying their governments in some way, or used as a pretext for a Russian invasion, as has happened in Ukraine. In the past years, the Kremlin has fought to influence public opinion of Russian speakers in the Baltic. Russian state media has depicted the Baltic states as historical collaborators with the Nazis, and framed the demolition of Soviet-era monuments in Latvia recently as an example of Latvia's apparent re-Nazification, using language eerily similar to that used to justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine. These arguments have more purchase with ethnic Russians in Latvia, who continue to be heavily influenced by pro-Russian media, but less so in Estonia, where government-funded Russian language media has done a good job of essentially replacing Kremlin propaganda. Russian minorities have also expressed an interest in secession. In 1993, the Estonian city of Narva, which is at least 90% ethnic Russian, voted 97% in favour of autonomy from Estonia in an unofficial referendum that was ignored by Estonia's government. However, while this anxiety is understandable, given what's happening in Ukraine, these policies might be a violation of what we might describe as Western or liberal norms, and possibly Russian minorities' human rights. The UN, for example, has claimed that the Latvian law phasing out the Russian language in schools violates Articles 29.1c and Article 30 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 13 of the UN's International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. In their response to the UN, the Latvian government has argued that states don't have an obligation to provide education in every minority language, and that the new law doesn't violate ethnic Russians' right to use their own language because they're still allowed to use their language in private. Nonetheless, even if it's not cut and dry, these new laws might discriminate against ethnic Russians. It's also worth saying that it looks like, if anything, these laws make a Russian retaliation more, not less likely, and it's not clear that there's any real risk of a Ukrainian-style invasion of the Baltics anytime soon. After all, if Russia is losing in Ukraine, they definitely can't win against NATO. So what do you think? Are these laws fair, or is this a knee-jerk and somewhat hypocritical violation of human rights? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. A few weeks ago, we were invited to Downing Street, where we were briefed on the government's anti-fraud plan. As part of this, we found out that more younger people have fallen victim to online scams than over 35s. And as our analytics frequently tell us, our audience skews younger, which means that you're likely in this age bracket. So if you want to protect yourself online, you should try NordVPN. NordVPN has a bunch of tools that keep you safe. First, they have a feature called Threat Protection, which protects you from malware, trackers, malicious ads, and phishing scams. But that's not all. NordVPN also has dark web monitoring services, which, even if you somehow do fall victim to online fraud or scams, notifies you if your details end up online, so you can promptly change your passwords and keep yourself protected. And what's more, if technology isn't really your thing, don't worry. NordVPN offers 24/7 customer support and even a 30-day money-back guarantee for all users. So check out our link in the description to get your discount on their 2-year plan, plus 4 extra months on top of that. Thanks for your support.